Greetings. So this week's topic kind of picks up where we left off last week, um, and hopefully I can keep the lesson kind of short this week. So for this week, I had you read a selection from Didier Fassin and Richard Reckman's Empire of Trauma. And these are French medical anthropologists that are approaching this issue from what we might call a science studies or an STS perspective, STS, science and technology studies, trying to get it as kind of the science of science itself. Like, how does science happen? How do we know things? How do we determine what is or is not true or is a scientific fact? So last week we read from the DSM and we looked at the psychological and psychiatric history of the notion of trauma, particularly as PTSD. Fasson is looking at trauma itself. So, looking at trauma itself, how is this relevant to war and society? Hopefully, we understood from last week's reading of the DSM and our lesson with that the notion of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, came into being in a way that was deeply connected to military experience and the concept of combat trauma. This week, for your reading, Fasson is looking at a sort of another side to this than what we talked about last week. He noted that there are two arenas of this whole trauma issue. One of these is the arena of psychiatry and psychology, and that's sort of what we talked about last week, the kind of the history of the discipline of psychiatry adopting post-traumatic stress disorder as a diagnosis. But the other side of this is kind of the global idea of trauma. This is a little bit more what Fasson wants to talk about here. So he's careful to note, as I hope that I have also been clear dealing with this subject, that he does not challenge the idea of trauma. He doesn't challenge that it exists. He's not challenging the validity of the PTSD diagnosis. He's very interested, though, in what has happened in our society in a really pretty short period of time. It was only in 1980 that PTSD became a recognized thing. That was only 40 years ago. In terms of human history, that's nothing. And Fasson recognizes that at that time, the image of the traumatized soldier is transformed in popular imagination. In just 40 years, the traumatized soldier has gone from being the archetypal image of weakness and malingering and is now seen as wounded and the full expression of human experience, kind of a pure version of humanity. So Fasson wants to know what this means. He wants to know, he wants to try to figure out how this happened. How did it come to be that there is this significant transformation in the way that we understand something like that in such a short period of time? And he calls this the reversing of truth, which is to say that what was considered true in society has changed. What was considered to be true just 40 years ago is something else now. We imagine something else to be a fact that we take for granted. So he cites the French philosopher Michel Foucault here, kind of in passing, but he's really utilizing Foucault's methodology here a lot, and I want to talk about that for a minute. Michel Foucault is very well known for his development of what we would call discourse theory, and we could do a whole class just on that, on discourse. But let's just say for our purposes that this is the theory that often through, particularly through the vehicle of language, what is said and understood in linguistic terms, the way that people are able to talk to each other, the way that people are able to think and communicate in text. through this vehicle of language, what is even thinkable in a period of time, what is true and what is not true, is limited and determined by this thing that Foucault calls a discourse. And discourses change over time. An example that Foucault is well known for in his elaboration of the way that discourses work, in his study, one of his books, The History of Sexuality, he notes the discourse of homosexuality as a thing. Uh, Foucault notes that if we go back just a few hundred years in European history, there was no concept of a kind of person who was called a homosexual person. Um, this was still a Christian society, and they considered same-sex or non-heteronormative sexual behavior to be sinful. However, according to Foucault, they did not necessarily think that there was a kind of person who was considered to be a homosexual person. Non-heteronormative sex was thought of as a sinful thing that people did. If someone did this, they were seen as someone who had committed a sin, but not necessarily that there's a kind of person that is this way. This distinction may be subtle, but Foucault would say that it matters a lot. And during the medicalization era, through a lot of mass scientific advancements that took place in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, even even into the 19th century, people started to develop a disease model of understanding human problems. And according to Foucault, it was in this era that the idea of the homosexual human came into being. So today, Foucault would say that the idea of some people being homosexual, like that being a particular kind of person, is something that's taken for granted, but was not necessarily so hundreds of years ago. And that change is a change in discourse. It's a way of thinking about things, and the way that we can understand something is shaped by and limited by this discourse. Using that platform, Fassin is looking at a change in discourse and trying to understand what that means. He would argue, Fassin would argue, that the notion of trauma, at least how we conceive of it today, is relatively new. Also, the idea that there's a disease called PTSD, and it being appropriate for us to imagine that people who are diagnosed with PTSD to be suffering from an injury is quite new. And in a relatively short period of time, there was a significant change in discourse. And this is what Foucault would call a discursive rupture, a rupture in the discourse with trauma. So let's go back and look at the way that Fassin opened up the passage that I had you read. He started the book with the September 11th terror attack in New York City. And acknowledging this, I realized that we're getting to a point where maybe most of y'all in this class were too young to remember that event. And maybe some of you are a little bit older and may remember it well. I remember it very well. I remember going to New York City when I was a teenager, and I remember seeing the Twin Towers there, being amazed at how big they were. I'd never seen buildings that were that big. It was kind of inconceivable to me before that. And then all of a sudden they were gone. The buildings were taken down with thousands of deaths, and we saw all this happening live on television and on the internet, and then over and over and over and over again in these images. And it was a massive cultural event. Having lived through that event and remembering when and how it happened and the impacts that it's had on the world and on a lot of our lives, it was a significant event. And Fassin notes that the moment that this occurred, it was immediately taken for granted that there was going to be a mass of traumatized people, and that the appropriate response was that these people were going to require psychiatric and psychological care. And there was this deployment of psychiatrists to address people's trauma. Now, when this happened in 2001, that was just barely 2 decades after PTSD showed up in the DSM. However, all of a sudden, it was already being taken for granted in society. Society takes for granted that trauma is a thing that exists. And while not questioning the reality of trauma, Fassin seems to think, he thinks that it's interesting that this happened, and he wants to look into it. It's relevant. He seems to argue that in this moment, including the notion of collective trauma, that this was going to be taken up and used for political purposes too. Things like justifying war and explaining how people experience that on all sides of it. In just 20 years before this event, the discourse did not include this notion of trauma the way that it had already become such a standard thing in society by then. So Fasson notes that in the field of trauma studies, there's this division over the idea of what exactly trauma even is. On one hand, there are people who would say that trauma is kind of like what happens when something is so bad that the experience of the traumatic event actually creates disorder in the process of memory. Your ability to remember, think about, and name the experiences of trauma are damaged by the event itself. And it is, in fact, that damage, this disordering of your memory and your thought process that's associated with that event that constitutes trauma. That's what trauma is, according to these theorists. Your processes of thinking and recalling and memory itself are actually damaged. It's like the infrastructure in your brain that connects you to this event through memory is damaged. And being traumatized, having a trauma diagnosis is because of that damage. On the other hand, there are people who would say that trauma is what happens when you remember the traumatic event all too well. Like it was very bad. You remember it, and it is in fact your clear understanding of the event and how bad it was that makes you traumatized. So that's kind of a different thing. They're not saying that it's the disorder in your memory that's causing the trauma. It's the fact that you remember it. You know what happened. You know it was bad. And being traumatized is your all too clear connection to the memory of this thing. Um, this debate is still ongoing. There's still people on both sides of that who feel strongly about it. Um, but that kind of thing is being debated, and there are very strong feelings on different sides about what it even means to be traumatized, for there to be a person who has experienced trauma and is a traumatized person who requires care because of this injury from the event. Um, there's still a lot of debate over what exactly that thing even is. Um, so from there, we get a little bit of a glimpse into what Fasson's actual motivation behind the book may be, or his hypothesis that's driving this research. He looks into the wide variety of things that constitute trauma, and there are so many of them. He notes that there is collective historical trauma, which is something that takes time and reflection to develop and doesn't seem to materialize directly from the event when it happens. Then there's trauma due to natural disasters. There's trauma due to abuse. There's even trauma that's associated with being the perpetrator of violence. And in the end, Fasson is prepared to argue that the universalization of trauma is ultimately a trivialization of all of these terrible experiences and events. And there are a lot of ways that people suffer, and a lot of unique experiences that have been endured by people. Terrible experiences that are very unique and happen in different ways and are remembered in different ways. And while the notion of trauma and having something like a PTSD diagnosis has given legitimacy to the suffering that comes from these experiences, Fasson is concerned that it ultimately trivializes and oversimplifies a lot of those things. So, from there, before I let you go, because next week we're going to go back a little bit further and we're actually going to read some Sigmund Freud. In the context of war and society, how might Fasson's argument apply? I want you to be thinking about that. How has the generation of this concept of trauma, which rolls so many experiences into one simple term, how has it affected the way that our society understands and relates to war? So I'm going to go ahead and end there, and I look forward to seeing you on Friday. Take care.